Minister of Canadian Heritage, Pablo Rodriguez, and the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Infrastructure and Communities, the Honorable Dominique LeBlanc, today announced over $2.4 million in funding for projects that will give Canadians the tools to identify online disinformation, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine. Don't you think it's odd that the only thing the Minister of Heritage talks about is censorship? I mean, name me one thing he's done for our heritage, for the culture, other than plot and scheme how to silence you. He really is a minister of censorship, isn't he? Then again, in the book 1984 by George Orwell, the Ministry of Propaganda was called the Ministry of Truth, wasn't it? So they're going to be fighting disinformation about COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, there is disinformation about every controversial topic in the world. Why are those two topics the two that Trudeau is obsessed with? I think it has to do with money in part. There are hundreds of billions of dollars at stake, trillions actually, with COVID-19 schemes. And don't forget that Trudeau himself bought literally 400 million doses of the vaccine. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent on lockdowns and his subsidies. There's a lot riding on your obedience to the official narrative. And the war in Russia and Ukraine, well, that I'm a little bit more puzzled by. Of course, Trudeau has had lots of photo ops on the subject, even Ukraine itself. And Canada has pledged money and weapons, but nowhere near the size and scale of what the U.S. is doing. So much of Trudeau's Ukraine project has just been symbolic, I think. I mean, Canada is not really an important country for Russia economically. The United Kingdom, the U.S., Cyprus, Germany, those are important places in terms of Russia and its oligarchs. None of those oligarchs are stashing money or assets in Canada. And as soon as Trudeau's sanctions actually caught something valuable, the Russian natural gas pipeline turbines that were being repaired in Montreal, Trudeau immediately caved in and let Russia have them back, literally amending the sanctions. So I'm not quite sure why Trudeau is obsessing over controlling the messaging about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, other than perhaps that NATO itself is obsessed, so he's just doing what he's told on that. But there's roughly 200 countries in the world. There are wars amongst them all the time. Right now, Yemen and Saudi Arabia are at war. Syria is in a civil war. Iraq is at war, civil war, and Iran's sort of undermining it. Much of the Maghreb region of Africa is in war. Jihadists in a dozen countries, including Nigeria. I'd add the Mexican drug cartel wars, and I'd add Burma in there too. And I'm not sure exactly what you'd call what's going on in Sri Lanka these days, but each of these is a violent struggle, and each is accompanied by nonviolent propaganda designed to aid each respective side. Do you know who the good guys are in Yemen? Do you really? How about in Mali? 20,000 people died last year in the war in Tigray. It's almost as many have died in Ukraine. Tigray, that's part of Ethiopia. Can you find it on a map? Are you worried about disinformation? Now, I'm not really. I just find it odd that the only disinformation that's being targeted by Trudeau is the disinformation that he has a personal political stake in. I suppose it's normal to counter foreign government propaganda when you're in a war, but Canada's not actually in a war. And Trudeau's plans are to censor not Russian journalists, but Canadian journalists. Not to somehow try to block Russian propaganda, but to demonize Canadian citizens as Russian agents and censor Canadians here. It's just like Trudeau and Biden blaming Vladimir Putin for inflation or gas prices. What a handy way to shift the blame for things that they've done and accuse others of disloyalty. I find it odd. Let me read more. Today's announcement is the result of a special call for proposals launched in March 2022. These projects are citizen-focused activities and funded under Canadian Heritage's Digital Citizen Initiative. The initiative promotes civic, news, and digital media literacy through funding third-party educational activities and programming to help citizens become resilient against disinformation. Of all the people in the world, would you trust government to tell you what journalists to believe and what journalists not to believe? Like, really, the government's going to choose that for you? The press release quotes the censorship minister saying, "The best defense against Russian disinformation is Canadian citizens armed with facts. These projects will give Canadians skills and tools to tell fact from fiction online. We live and work better as a society when we have a common set of facts." It's by Pablo Rodriguez, who calls himself the Minister of Heritage. I think it's good to have a common understanding with people, but I also think it's important to be able to dissent, to critique, to disagree, to say, no, I disagree with the mainstream way of thinking. Like I say, our whole system, our whole political system, our whole legal system, indeed the scientific method itself, depends on challenging and refuting things that were once the establishment consensus. Does the sun revolve around the earth? That was once a government and church-approved fact. Is the earth flat? So is that. It was disinformation to claim otherwise. We need a reliable and credible source of information, not like that Galileo. When he published disinformation, he was prosecuted and convicted in an inquisition in 1633, and he was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. 1633 isn't that long ago. It was 150 years after Columbus found America. But you can be much more current than that. Are women persons? Should women have the right to vote? That's a controversy of about 100 years ago. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but in Canada, status Indians under the Indian Act did not have the right to vote in elections until the 1960s. Like I say, those were accepted truths until then. Anyone who said otherwise was an unreliable, incredible troublemaker. It's disinformation to say that Indians can vote. It's disinformation to say that women should vote. That was standard establishment thinking until a few decades ago. Imagine the government demanding that you accept their facts, and even more so, their sources. It's like Anthony Fauci declaring that he himself was the science, so don't criticize him.
There's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, there's a face, there's a voice you can recognize, you see him on television. So it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science.
What you just saw was an excerpt from my nightly show, The Ezra Levant Show. Every weekday, I do a monologue. Usually it's about half an hour. Then I interview an interesting guest, and then we read my hate mail or my fan mail, whichever is more fun. It's only available behind a paywall, though. That's how we pay our bills here at Rebel News. We don't take a dime from Justin Trudeau. But the good news is it's only $8 a month, about half the price of Netflix. And in addition to my nightly show, you also get weekly shows from 4 other friends here at Rebel News. So you're getting 36 shows a month just for $8. I think it's worth it. And even if you're not quite sure, do it anyways, because we rely on viewers like you to keep us free and independent. I promise you I'll never take a dime from Trudeau. Just go to rebelnewsplus.com and click subscribe. Thanks.